All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we're going to be focusing on time period number 2 today, and really the major focus of time period 2 is going to be British colonial America. The Spanish are still have colonies in the New World. The French are developing colonies in the New World, but really kind of our focus in this time period is primarily the British. And the British colonies fall into three major sections. So it's the Southern colonies, the New England colonies, and the Middle colonies. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, you do have to be able to, one, compare these different regions of the British colonies, so the southern, New England, and middle colonies, and know their major characteristics, but also be able to compare the British colonies as a whole to the Spanish and the French colonies in the time period. All right, so let's jump into it and first take a look at the southern colonies. So we're going to try and go geographic, political, social, economic, and religious through all these different colonies in a nice overview. So when you're looking at the southern colonies, the first thing that you want to kind of remember is there's two regions of the southern colonies. You have what's known as the Chesapeake Bay region, which is the upper part of the South. So that's basically Maryland and Virginia. And then you have the lower southern colonies, which is the Carolinas and Georgia. Overwhelmingly, this is a very conducive geography to growing cash crops. So you're going to have tobacco be a major cash crop in the upper South, which is the Chesapeake Bay, and rice and indigo be major cash crops in the lower South. That's primarily due to the weather and the soil. So the soil, as we talked about, this is kind of the upper part of what's called the Black Belt region, which means that it has very rich, dark soil and is great for growing crops, specifically these intensive cash crops that are going to be grown in these parts of the South. Now, when you look at the Southern economy, as I just stated, it's going to be primarily run on a cash crop driven economy. If you remember, the founders of the Chesapeake Bay specifically are sent by a joint stock company. And really the drive here is to make money and make money as fast as possible. So if you remember, they're trying to find gold, they're trying to find silver, but they're not having any luck with that in the beginning. So they're going to turn to a cash crop of tobacco, which happens to thrive in the region and thrive in the geography. And cash crop very quickly spreads to be tobacco very quickly spreads to be the major cash crop of the region. And that's going to completely dominate the economy. So when you think southern colonies, you want to think cash crops, you want to think tobacco in the upper South or the Chesapeake Bay region, and you want to think rice and indigo in the lower South. It is also important to remember the names of the regions, right? So the Chesapeake Bay, you want to remember that name, and then the lower South for the sub-region of the lower part of the South. Now, the economics kind of influences the social aspects of the South. So because the South is going to be a cash crop economy, they're largely going to be dependent on forced labor systems. Okay, you're going to have large plantations that develop in the southern colonies to kind of accumulate as much wealth through growing tobacco and growing rice and indigo as possible. So in the beginning, the British are going to turn to a system of indentured servitude in order to do this. So if you remember, these are temporary slaves in a way that are coming from European society. They sign these contracts for 4 to 7 years, and they come to the New World to work on these plantations, and their voyage is paid for usually either by the company itself that wants to kind of gain settlers, or the plantation owners themselves. In exchange, they're kind of, at the end, they're going to get these freedom dues and these freedom rights. Now, this is the original setup of their forced labor system. Indentured service coming mostly from Europe. By the late 1600s, it starts to shift. And we talked about the effect that Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 has on this. This has an impact on shifting to African slavery and bringing in African slaves into the southern colonies. There's also factors in Europe, such as a slowdown in the need to kind of come to the New World for a better life. There's more access to better jobs within European society at the time as well. So what they're going to end up doing in the southern colonies is turn to African slavery, and they kind of tap into this slave trade that's been going on in the Spanish colonies and the Portuguese colonies for hundreds of years at this point. And this is going to bring a new racial dynamic to the southern colonies, and this is when you're going to start to see race kind of be embedded into American life and discrimination based off of race and kind of associating slavery with a specific race of people is going to start in this late 1600s, early 1700s of the southern colonies. Now, politically speaking in the South, they are going to have the development of democracy. So you want to remember this, that across all of these different colonies, there are elements of democracy in the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And here a good example of democratic ideas is going to be the Virginia House of Burgesses. So the Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, is going to put forth this idea of elected representation as a format for governing. So this is unique to the British colonies, that they're going to have elements of democracy. In this case, it's kind of an indirect representative democracy through the Virginia House of Burgesses. Okay, so that's kind of like a snapshot of your southern colonies. Now, if we look up to the north and we look at the New England colonies, first off, the two major colonies, I guess, the one that we focused on in class really is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And an offshoot of the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be Rhode Island. So those are two important colonies up in New England. They're both founded by this religious dissenter group called the Puritans, but they end up forming very different types of colonies up in New England. So I think the principal one to keep in mind for New England is going to be Massachusetts Bay. They're a good example. When you're going back to the southern colonies, the one that you really want to keep in mind as your example for comparative purposes is probably the Chesapeake Bay. So you want Chesapeake Bay in the south. In New England, you want to think Massachusetts Bay, and to know Rhode Island kind of as an offshoot of that. So starting with geography up in New England has a totally different geography in a lot of ways than the southern colonies. First, the climate is vastly different. It's a lot colder than it is in the south, and the growing season is a lot shorter. They also have a different type of soil, a much rockier soil. So it is not going to be conducive to cash crop economies up in New England. They're going to have to turn to other ways to kind of providing and surviving. So the first thing that you want to think about when you think about New England, you want to think religion when you think of this area of the colonies. Religion permeates and influences every part of their life. So the founders of these New England colonies are going to come from a specific denomination of Protestantism called Puritanism. And Puritanism is really the English version of Calvinism. Okay, so it's a very strict version of the Protestant religion, and these are very devout religious people. So when they come to New England, they're really trying to bring their vision, their utopian vision, to the New World, and they view themselves, as famously in John Winthrop's speech when he gives the City Upon a Hill speech before they disembark and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they view themselves as they're going to set the example for the rest of the world about a religious utopian society and like the right way to live a just Christian life. So religion influences everything in their society, and that is something you want to remember. And you want to be able to make those connections with how does their religious beliefs influence the society that's set up? How does their religious beliefs influence the politics that's set up? How does their religious beliefs influence the economy that they develop? And be able to see those connections. So if you look in a basic sense, the center of their communities is going to be the town. The town plays a big role. So they're very community-minded people. They believe in this idea of covenants amongst each other, right? The Puritans believed that they had a purpose and a purpose from God. And so they believe that they have to work with one another in these tight-knit communities. And the center of their community is going to be the town, with this meeting house that doubles as a school. It's a religious building. It's where they hold political meetings. So unlike the South, which is kind of spaced out and has these big plantations, New England is going to be a little bit more tightly knit communities, and they don't have these vast, huge plantations. They do have farming, but it's more subsistence farming, right? We talked about yeoman farmers up in New England. And the Puritans are famous for their work ethic, driven by their religious beliefs, and it makes their colonies prosperous, but not on the scale as far as plantation style, as far as in the same way that the southern colonies are. Now, politics, they're also going to develop form of democracy. So there's a big similarity amongst all these different regions of the colonies that they have some form of democracy. And in this case, they're going to have a more direct form of democracy. So they're going to establish these things called New England town hall meetings, where male Puritans in the community are allowed to participate and vote on the big issues facing their colonies. So this is a pretty unique thing in the colonial world. And it again shows like the elements of democratic ideas forming in the British colonies. Some specific examples of this would be like the Mayflower Compact, established before the Pilgrims disembarked at Plymouth. So you have a specific example if you want to use that as a specific example. This is an example of a document called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was the first constitution, the first written constitution in the New World. So you definitely, again, have elements of this democratic ideas. And remember, the British are practicing this policy of salutary neglect. They're allowing their colonies to develop on their own a little bit and self-govern, which is highly different than some of these other colonies that, from the Spanish and the French that are happening at the same time. Economically, when you think of the New England colonies, is trading. So they're very much involved in overseas trade. Shipbuilding is a big part of their economy as well, and timber. And they're going to be involved in trading across the Atlantic Ocean in this triangular trade, and even getting involved to a certain extent in the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. All right, our last region of the colonies is going to be the middle colonies. So when we talked about the middle colonies, we really focused on two colonies. We focused on Pennsylvania and we focused on New York. So I think when you think of the middle colonies, the big thing to think about is the diversity of people that they attract to the middle colonies and why that's the case. So we're going to focus a little bit on Pennsylvania and a little bit on New York. Geographically, it's kind of in between the New England colonies and your southern colonies. So the soil is pretty good, but it's not warm enough to really grow some of your extensive cash crops like tobacco, rice, or indigo. So they're going to be developing other types of economies. Some of it's going to be merchant-based. So it's like a mixture. It's a mixture of like New England and like your southern colonies. It can be some merchant-based, and some big cities develop here like Philadelphia and New York, places of commerce. And then you're also going to have the development of a lot of farms, but more kind of like grain farming and growing large farms for, wheat and corn and grains. So when you look at the Pennsylvania colony, really what you want to associate that with is the Quakers. Okay, so the Quakers established Pennsylvania to find a safe haven for Quakers, and then New York was originally a Dutch colony, and then the British are going to take over New York. And they kind of inherit some of the cosmopolitan nature of New York City and kind of the trading that takes place there. So when you look at important religious ideas, it's really the Quakers that kind of dominate, like I said, in Pennsylvania. Now, if you remember, they call Pennsylvania the Holy Experiment. The Quakers were trying to establish their utopian society, and they're a very tolerant group of people. And so they want religious tolerance. They treat the natives pretty well and kind of get along well with the natives. And so they are really kind of tolerant of a lot of people. And what that does is it brings in a lot of other types of people, a lot of other types of religions that don't share the tolerance that the Quakers have. And so you end up with a colony that does not actually bring like William Penn's vision to fruition in the end, because other people are bringing their own ideas and are really not as tolerant and as open as the Quakers are. Politically, again, they share in common this idea of democratic rule and this idea of allowing the colonists to have a say in the government. And that's a big theme throughout this whole colonial world of the British, allowing the colonists to have some kind of say in the government and an idea of self-government that's happening. The last thing to kind of take a look at here with the middle colonies is their economy, and they're known as the breadbasket of the colonial world. So they're growing a lot of wheat and corn and providing a lot of food for the colonies. And so this is kind of their trademark economically. So when you look at the middle colonies, you want to think diversity, right? Diversity in New York is kind of driven by the fact that New York City becomes a trading center. Diversity in Pennsylvania really is driven around the fact that the Quakers are such a tolerant religion of other religious groups. So they offer kind of this idea of freedom of religion When you look at the Puritans in New England, the Puritans in New England are very intolerant, right? So you think about Roger Williams, who's another Puritan. They're so intolerant that he has to leave and form his own colony of Rhode Island as a religious dissenter. So you have religious dissension within New England, not so much in the middle colonies. All right, we're going to